11 o'clock, welcome in. It is the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs. Tyrod Westminster and Chris Clark along with you on this Friday. Big weekend of Gamecock sports getting rolling later on this afternoon. Women's team in action in the Sweet 16 taking on Indiana. Going to be talking to our guy Chris Wellbaum coming up here shortly, but getting closer and closer to hopefully the next weekend wrapping up a undefeated season and maybe a national championship. Got to get through the Hoosiers later on today.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting game, of course, and we got a lot of coverage on GamecockCentral.com right now from Chris Wellbaum and Markeisha Grant as well. We'll be hearing from Chris, like you said, here momentarily. I think he was at practice yesterday, so excited to hear from him. I know Dawn Staley, who always keeps it real in her press conferences, she had some interesting comments about practice and this team that I think she tries to remind us is still actually very young, which is probably the most impressive thing, even though we all already know it. But it's you just kind of have to remind yourself for them to be undefeated as young as they are and to be able to have kind of some letdown games but still find a way to win. It is so impressive. And looking forward to seeing them compete tonight. I certainly think that they'll beat Indiana. Indiana's a good team, got a few good players. I don't think they can match South Carolina for 40 minutes of basketball.
Yeah, they do have some really good players. And what was it, a couple years ago? Obviously different team, right? But this was an Indiana team that gave South Carolina their only loss in the regular season, right? A couple years ago.
Yep.
I think that was. And so, you know, I'm sure
2019.
2019.
In the Virgin
Islands. A couple
Islands.
years ago in the Virgin Islands, right. So, yeah, noted on GamecockCentral.com by Markeisha Grant, actually. So I should have read that part a little bit further before I spoke. But Mackenzie Holmes is a really good player. I mean,
She was on that team.
she was on that team. I did remember
She's been
her.
around for a while.
She has been around for a while, but she's a post player who can do a lot of things for you. She can rebound, she can block shots. She's got big physical presence. Of course, South Carolina will be able to counter with Camila Cardoso, who also does those things well. But going to be a really interesting matchup. And I'm with Wes. What was the line on this game? Because we discussed this the other day. It's a little bit
I think it was
smaller
15.
than we thought.
15 and a half,
15
I
and a
think.
half.
15 and
It's
a half.
bounced around a little bit, but yeah, right around 15, 16.
Yeah. I mean, I could see it being that. And I put in a prediction for Brian Shoemaker's predictions piece, and I honestly can't even remember what it was, but it was somewhere around there. And so I think ultimately, you know, getting out in front a little bit, a comfortable win for South Carolina, but also I think more of a challenge in the first two rounds where they were not challenged whatsoever, really.
Well, and I go back to Sunday where, look, Presbyterian, we knew that was probably going to be a walk in the park, and it exactly was, just like it was in the regular season for Carolina. But I think we looked at the North Carolina game and said, okay, this is a team that, well, we didn't think, was going to give them too much trouble, could make things interesting, but South Carolina just ended up bludgeoning them in the first half. But as we've seen in years past, as you get deeper and deeper into this thing, you run into better teams, obviously, and this is an Indiana team that is very good, one that beat Iowa pretty handily just a month ago, towards the end of the regular season. So they have the experience of playing in big games against some of the best teams in the country. And while, again, we're all going to lean heavily towards South Carolina in this one, with that 15.5 point line, it could be a game that maybe South Carolina doesn't pull away from until late in the going.
So the advantage, obviously, of being the number one overall seed is that in a true tournament format, in theory, like you said, the teams are going to get more and more difficult. If you were kind of an underdog, that might not necessarily be the case. It would depend on some other things. But as the number one seed, in theory, teams will get better and better and better. However, South Carolina is a talented enough team, a good enough team that I would say they have reached the point almost regardless of opponent. Now they may run into a Texas, a Southern Cal. I honestly, me personally, this Iowa team, I don't even put them in this category where this doesn't apply. But for most of the teams South Carolina plays, and I would include Indiana, it's really just more about South Carolina. Like if South Carolina performs to their standard, nobody other than maybe those handful of teams is really capable of beating them. Like, is Indiana capable of beating them tonight? Of course, but that is going to also rely on South Carolina not playing to their potential. And I don't think that means you have to play your A++ game, which we saw last week. Like that's about as well as you could possibly play. But if you play a B game in your South Carolina, then I think even an A game for Indiana, it's tough for Indiana to win. Maybe it's tighter than we expect, but
Sure.
I just think South Carolina is so deep, and we've talked about that all year long. But again, stealing from Markeisha here, Indiana had 1 bench point last week.
Mm-hmm.
South Carolina's bench outscored North Carolina's entire team.
Right.
So, and this game can play out multiple ways. If South Carolina's hitting shots early on, then I don't. Now, Indiana can score. Like they're top 15 scoring offense. They actually lead the country in field goal percentage. Now, South Carolina's defense also leads the country in field goal percentage as far as stopping opponents.
Yes.
So, there's some balance there. If both teams are hot early, can Indiana keep pace with South Carolina early on? That there's a scenario where that happens.
Yeah.
However, can Indiana keep pace with South Carolina for an entire game? I think that would be tough on them.
And that's where we see South Carolina ultimately win out, especially when you mention that bench and just how deep this team is, where as you get late into the second half, South Carolina can rotate in an entire fresh starting five and still not have any drop-off, where these other teams, do have a difference between the girls that are on the court and the girls that are sitting on the bench, and that's where South Carolina pulls away from a lot of these better teams. It's going to be interesting later on today, and again, as long as South Carolina doesn't shoot themselves in the foot, they don't turn the ball over 24 times like they did against Texas A&M the other week, they should be fine. But again, now you're getting into the next round of the tournament. You're looking to potentially maybe being matched up with Notre Dame once again in the Elite Eight if you win this game today. And, it gets tougher and tougher and tougher as you pursue hopefully another national championship at the end of next weekend. Yeah,
I was looking, too, at some of the Indiana coach Terry Moore and some of her comments. And, she was talking about Camila Cardoso because this is an Indiana team that's going to lack, aside from Mackenzie Holmes, their really good experienced post player. They actually don't have any player taller than 6'3", and the Gamecocks have multiple, right? And their coach is just kind of like, look, Cardoso, they're just too talented. They're too good of a basketball team. You're not going to keep Cardoso from scoring, right? And so I look at the rebounding. Chris Wellbaum pointed this out, and we'll probably get his take on this, but South Carolina's top 5 in the nation in rebounding margin. Indiana, they're 89th. They're in the negative in terms of rebounding margin this season. I think the size is something that plays into that. But to your point, just this South Carolina team, the reason that they're undefeated is they can do so many different things. They can rebound offensive and defensive. They can play defense. They could throw so many different – they could play any style. They can shoot from outside. They could shoot mid-range, get to the basket, put it inside. I mean, there's so many different things that they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, they get that game coming up later on today. 5 o'clock tip, pregame coverage starting at 4:30 on our sister station, 98.5 WOMG, as, again, South Carolina looks to stay perfect on this season. And I want to dive into some cuts real quick here from Dawn Staley. We will go to cut number 13 here, Dave. This is Dawn Staley when asked about how our team is feeling coming into this game.
We got a pretty loose team. So you saw the beginning of practice, and they were pretty focused for about 30 minutes, and then they went into a mode of being really loose, but focused. I think they're probably more focused than they've ever been, but for a certain amount of time in practice. So I'm real thankful that the NCAA only gave us 60 minutes because I couldn't take any more than 60 minutes.
It's good when the biggest complaint is what's happening in practice as opposed to what's happening in the actual game. But talking about a team that's feeling loose after what they did this past weekend in the first 2 rounds of the tournament, I feel like they have every right to feel loose, feel confident about what they did. But, it's time to lock back in, focus on the task at hand, which, again, Dawn Staley's done an incredible job in her entire time here at South Carolina, making sure her team is always up to the task. And I think they'll be locked in and ready to go at 5 o'clock.
Dawn Staley's the most keep it real in the press conference coach I've maybe ever heard. So I appreciated that. And, I think we have seen now it is 2 games, but, it does seem like they have kind of flipped the switch and gone to a different level in terms of how focused they are. And there's a fine line. Like, you don't want to be out there goofing off for 60 minutes and getting nothing out of it in practice. And, as I get older, I do sort of more agree with what the adults were saying when you were younger and you thought practice didn't matter. Practice does matter. And I'm sure for a veteran coach like Dawn Staley, there has been times this year, as good as the record on the court has been, that it's probably been very frustrating. But she has had to, I'm sure, adjust to the youth that she has with this team. And they've found a mix of focus and looseness that works for them. And so far, so good. That's worked out every single time. We'll see if it continues this week. And I obviously, I think it will. I'm looking more and more. You look at Indiana. Yes, they score. They're top 15. They're right at 15 in scoring. Like I talked about as far as field goal percentage, first in the country. But they don't shoot three-pointers very well. And so to beat South Carolina when you're a team that doesn't have a lot of size in the paint, you don't have a great bench, and you aren't just a great shooting team from outside, that's going to be a tough task because I think South Carolina, if they want to, they can go really, really big on you and force you to shoot over them. And so to me, getting out of the caveat you always say is like, it's sports. Anything can happen. Anybody can have that game. Maybe Indiana has a girl hit 5 3-pointers tonight that just hasn't hit
20% three.
Yeah, that hasn't hit 5 in 20 games combined. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's sports. Those things can happen.
Sure.
But on paper, this just does not feel like a great matchup for Indiana when you dive into it. Not just the fact that we know South Carolina is incredible, and I'd pick them against anybody, frankly.
Sure.
But just when you get down to how these teams are built and what they do well, Indiana, now they're 5 girls. They're 5 girls that play. The ball's going to be spread around a lot. I think they're all scoring in double digits. Like, they have great balance among their top 5. But once you get past that, the fact you don't have sharpshooters from outside either, I think the scariest thing for South Carolina is a team that just could just basically get incredibly hot and has that ability to shoot from the outside and get yourself into one of those, 90 to 90 type battles.
Like Iowa or no?
No.
Just checking.
For sure. We'll get more insight with our guy Chris Wellbaum from Gamecock Central coming up here in just a moment. But we'll remind you, next Friday, April the 5th, is the 107.5 Game Spring Golf Tournament out at the Charwood Golf Club in West Columbia. If you want to take part, it's $400 for a foursome, $200 for a pair. 10 a.m. shotgun start. Going to be giving away USC baseball tickets, K1 tickets, concert tickets, scrap your passports, and much, much more. If you want to take part, give Charwood a call at 803-755-2000 to register. Again, 803-755-2000 to register. Chris Wellbaum, Gamecock Central, going to be talking to us about women's basketball coming up next here on The Game. Welcome back in. It's the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs. Tyler Head, Wes Metro, and Chris Clark along with you here on this Friday, getting you set for women's basketball in the Sweet 16 as they take on Indiana. Later on today at 5 o'clock, you can listen to that on sister station 98.5 WOMG. Welcome back in. As always, our guy Chris Wellbaum from Gamecock Central to talk about this South Carolina women's team. Chris, I want to start off. This is the first time we've had you on this week. How impressed were you with what South Carolina was able to do to North Carolina in the round of 32 on Sunday?
It was amazing. North Carolina played them tight, played them close, played them, physical up there in Chapel Hill, and they got tired of hearing about it and came out and just absolutely dismantled them. It's probably the most dominating game they've had this season. North Carolina was an 8 seed, but I thought they could have been more like a 6. So that was a good team, and not just a good team, but one that has given South Carolina trouble, and they just absolutely crushed them. So there was some concern that South Carolina was maybe peaked earlier in the season and was limping to the end, but that's another peak last week.
Hey, Chris, Don Staley, I would say, kind of half joked, but really didn't joke at all about the 60 minutes and how this team was focused for about 30 minutes, and then they got maybe, a little bit more. They were having fun at practice, I guess you'd say. But what has that dynamic been like, just from your perspective, being around the team a lot, and Don Staley yourself, as I imagine, had to kind of adjust a little bit to the youth in this locker room, but they've found a way to stay focused enough when needed as well. So what's your perspective on kind of the focus versus staying loose versus, hey, this is just still a very young group, even though they're undefeated?
Yeah, South Carolina's for a long time had this team mentality of work hard, play hard, where they're going to be goofy, have a lot of fun, but when it comes time to practice, to lift weights, to play the games, whatever it may be, they're going to lock in. And a lot of that goes to Asia Wilson because that's her personality, and she just imposed that on the team. And the last few years with the freshies, they were goofy, they played around, but they were mostly focused on basketball. This team seems like they're focused on everything but basketball. And they feed off of each other, where they really are like little kids, like a daycare. Where just the other day, it was nobody's birthday, but somebody found a bag of birthday balloons, and so they blew them up and were throwing them at each other in the locker room. And there's just an extra layer of goofiness and silliness and just joy that not that the past few teams haven't had fun, but this team is just over the top. And it's really interesting how they for the most part, know when to flip that switch. Because I asked Bree Hall and a few of the other more veteran players, like, do you guys ever have to say, okay, now it's time to focus? And Bree told me, no, we just all know when to flip that switch.
That kind of reminds me in a way of, y'all remember how weird those baseball teams were for Carolina that ended up winning the national championships, 2010, 2011. Ray Tanner would go in the locker room just be like, what are you guys doing? Like, y'all are extremely weird, but they obviously had something to them. Chris, let's dive into this matchup with Indiana. I think Wes made some great points in the last segment in that, and when you start diving into the numbers and how Indiana plays versus how South Carolina plays, it doesn't seem to be a great matchup at all for the Hoosiers. What do you see in the matchups here?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a matchup where Indiana's weak points happen to be South Carolina's strengths. And the spread's, I think, 15.5, and I actually think that's a little low. Indiana's a good team, and we're not trying to slight Indiana. It's just that everyone has weak points, and theirs happen to be in the wrong spots. They're not particularly big, and the size they do have is not really physical post size. Like, It's more physical guard size. That's a big problem against South Carolina. And then they don't defend the three-point shot well. They're 180th in the country. That's a problem when you're going against the second best three-point shooting team in the country, and you're having to figure out how to guard those posts that you don't really match up with. It's a real pick your poison for Indiana. Are we going to double Cardoso and Watkins and company and hope the shooters don't hit, or are we going to stay home and hope Cardoso doesn't go for 20 and 15?
When you look at this Indiana offense, obviously Mackenzie Holmes been around there for a while. Team's leading scorer, who's going to be matched up with Cardoso throughout this game. We also have a couple of very effective three-point shooters, two of the best in the Big Ten, in Sarah Scalia and Yarden Garzon. Do you have maybe a comparison with this offense to another team in the SEC that South Carolina maybe would have faced earlier on this season?
I'm not sure there's another SEC team, but they play a very typical. Someone joked the other day they called it a Midwestern style, and there's some truth to that. It's their offense is very patient, and I hesitate to say deliberate because that implies that it's slow, but they don't want to run and gun. They want to work their half-court offense, create mismatches and get shots, and they shoot the ball really well. And that's how a lot of teams in that part of the country play. You know, you look at South Dakota State, who doesn't play at the same level but still has the same style that South Carolina played earlier in the season. It's not quite the way Iowa plays because Caitlin Clark can create so many mismatches on her own with her shooting range, but it's in the same vein.
Well, so we can look ahead. Obviously, the team tries not to, but we can look ahead. And by the time South Carolina tips off this evening, they'll already know who their next opponent would be, assuming they beat Indiana. We obviously won't have a show between now and that game. So what do you already kind of know, even if it's just kind of broad strokes, about – you obviously saw Carolina on TV play Notre Dame in Paris earlier this year, and then Oregon State. What can you tell us and the listeners about those two teams? And do you think Notre Dame wins that, or do you think it's going to be pretty tight?
I think Oregon State wins today because Notre Dame's had just terrible injury luck the past 18 months or so. And when they lost, they were another team that already really thin on the front line. And they lost probably their most reliable post player, Kylie Watson, to an ACL injury in the ACC tournament. And again, we talked about matchups. Oregon State has a really good post player named Reagan Beers. And so you got a mismatch there of who does Notre Dame have that can slow down Reagan Beers. Now, the one thing Notre Dame has is Hannah Hidalgo, because she can make a lot of things happen. So I don't think it's a definite Oregon State win, but it's going to be tough for Notre Dame. And if Notre Dame does advance, it'll be even tougher going against the post depth of South Carolina. Oregon State's a veteran team that, like I said, they have a really good post player that kind of makes them go. They're very battle tested coming out of the Pac-12. At one point, they were in contention for a 1 seed, so they're dangerous. But another team they don't have a lot of postseason experience. So is what they went through in the Pac-12 going to be enough to get them a deep tournament run? You know, we'll find out how they handle it today.
All right, Chris, appreciate your insight, and we're looking forward to the game coming up later on today, and we'll check in with you again next week.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Again, Chris Wilbaum from Gamecock Central. That game tipping off today at 5 o'clock. Once again, you can hear it on our sister station, 98.5 WOMG. I'll remind you once again about the Palmetto Citizens Federal Credit Union Grand Slam giveaway going on all baseball season long. Head on over to 1075thegame.com and enter for your chance to win when the Gamecock hitter hits a Grand Slam. You could be the lucky recipient of all the money in the pot, as we are currently sitting at $625 they head into game number 2, taking on Alabama coming up later on tonight, which you'll be able to listen to right here on the Game as well. Coming up, we will continue on our conversation as we roll through the rest of the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour. I got to bounce over to Quaker State and Lube to meet up with Terry Ford for the 12 show, but Chris and Wes will ride with you for the rest of the half hour here on the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs on the Game.
Well, another thing you don't want to be without is an outstanding audio-visual setup in your home. If you've always wanted that man cave, that home theater, even if you just look around your living room or wherever you hang out and go, man, this just isn't good enough. I get it. I've been there. Our friends at Integrated Media can help you take things to the next level from an audio-visual standpoint at your house. They can mount a TV. They can hide all the wires. They can source the equipment for you. You can actually go to their store in Chapin, check out some products. They can tell you what's the best, so you don't have to go to the big box stores. They can get the equipment for you, and they can install it for you. They can do everything from just mounting a TV to a complete home theater system, security and cameras, and even a smart home system in your home. IntegratedMediaInc.com is where you can go to learn more. You can check out their gallery and learn more about their services, or you can give them a call. Michael, Nathan, 803-948-8327. Again, that's the great team at Integrated Media. They've been to my home. They've been to Wes's home. Let them come out to yours. IntegratedMediaInc.com.
All right, welcome back. Wes Mitchell, Chris Clark, Gamecock Central Takeover. Tyler has left us in charge. We'll try to keep the train on the tracks here. Getting ready for South Carolina women's basketball later on today, 5 o'clock tip, around 5 o'clock, ESPN. Spring football practice still going on, so we're going to dive into that a bit here. Chris and I were out at practice yesterday. Also, it was kind of a busy week, I guess, lost in some of the women's basketball talk and everything else going on in Gamecock Nation. You had offensive players talking, defensive players talking, some coaches not talking, and wide receiver coach Mike Furry and Coach Torian Gray both speaking on their respective position groups yesterday. Chris, you want to go offense or defense first, man?
Let's go offense.
We're going offense. Dave, let's hit number 2 here from Furry. And as always, when a new coach comes in, I think there's a little bit of a filling out process as far as new coach, new guys. Everybody has to kind of find out what everybody's all about. And Furry was asked about that yesterday.
Well, I think the biggest thing is coming into that room and not demanding what I want out of that room right away, not trying to build up to that moment. We ain't got time for that, you know. And I think the biggest thing is coming in and setting those standards that we want, what type of players that we want to become, how we want to help this football team. And this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to start now. And we're going to have to grow up fast. And I think that's been the best part about all of it is the guys have responded to that really, really well. You know, rather it's the meeting rooms, rather it's just questions or text messages. The communication has been phenomenal. I've seen it very quickly that there's a big care factor and an understanding of our guys that they do need to learn a lot about football, not just how to play the game, but also the football IQ, right? That helps you stay around the game, and those things have been great so far.
You know, you look at some of the positions on this team, Chris, and then some of the spots, even with brand new coaches, where you say, well, man, that guy inherited a nice little room. That guy inherited several players that either have played a lot of ball at South Carolina or have played a lot of ball elsewhere and then have transferred in. Receiver room, you know, you could say that. Yes, there's guys on this unit that have played a lot of ball elsewhere, but then you kind of break it down, and a lot of them are making the jump to the SEC level. Several, or at least 2 true freshmen that are already on campus, and kind of going through that freshman battle where I'm sure you're going to have good days and bad days. That's the case with any freshman that gets here. But, you know, it is a situation with him where it's kind of almost a clean slate coming in for this receiver group, I think.
Yeah, and I think they needed a clean slate, you know, in some ways. You're losing a couple guys who are really good players, obviously, in Juice, who, you know, you kind of put that to the side because he didn't play, but only a little bit last year. But the reality is, like, he could have been back in a scenario. Xavier Legette, obviously, on to the NFL. And so you've got an interesting room, one of the most interesting rooms on this entire team, I think, Wes, because, you know, you've brought some new guys in. You've brought in a couple talented freshmen. You have some others that you're looking to make some moves. You've got the possibility that there's going to be another new face or two after the spring, right? We know the staff will probably go into the portal. And so you have a lot of question marks here, even with guys that you feel good about, because you can make a good argument, a compelling argument. You've got more depth than you did last year. Last year you had Legette, and then you had, quite frankly, some inconsistencies, some question marks. You feel like you're probably going to have more depth this year because you brought in some guys in Gage Larvanan and Amari Huggins-Bruce and Jared Brown who've played a lot of ball. But it's also a question because they are transitioning to a new team. And then who's going to be the guy? Or will there be a the guy at all? Will it be more of a by-committee approach to who's catching the footballs this year?
Yeah, and I think as we sit right now, on paper, you'd imagine it's probably going to be kind of by committee. I think that's the most likely thing. Now, we don't know if it's going to play out like that. And I'm curious to see, like, is there a guy you would already circle and say, if there is going to be what I kind of call the alpha of the group, is there going to be an alpha to emerge? This time last year, I don't really think we would have circled Legette yet as being the alpha of the bunch. And I do think, you know, I looked at when we thought Juice Wells was returning, I looked at it like, okay, you had Wells 2 seasons ago, and he emerged as your best wide receiver. Then Wells was hurt, but Leggett emerged, and you're sitting there saying, well, Juice can kind of retake his spot as the best receiver. And the guy, I think most importantly, what it comes down to, it's not necessarily, oh, this guy's going to catch 50 balls, or is it 60 passes, is it 7, whatever. I don't care about stats. It's more about which guy, when the defense starts to put together their game plan, do they say, I'm most concerned about that guy. I'm circling 17. Very quickly, you watched the North Carolina film last year, and you went in the next game, you said, if you're a defense coordinator, I'm circling number 17.
Yeah.
As the year progressed last year, you probably started to circle number 3. The season before is what I'm saying. Who will defensive coordinators circle and say, we got to stop that guy? I don't think we have that answer yet. Gage Larvadan has started to, I think, produce a little bit of attention in spring camp. Too early to know. Also, he's not a big guy. None of these guys are big guys. And I think that matchup part of that ultimately is part of the equation as well. But here, cut 3, Dave, he did talk extensively about what Larvadan has done so far for South Carolina in practice.
Yeah, I've really been impressed with him, along with other guys that are in that room. I think to play wideout, you have to have some confidence, and you got to have a little swagger to you. You got to be tough. You got to be mentally tough and physically tough. And he has the skill set where he's explosive and dynamic in his transitions. He's got great ball skills. And but his desire to continue to want to learn has even been probably the most impressive thing that I've seen since we've been here. But he has made some plays. He's getting comfortable with what we're asking him to do, and he's starting to be able to showcase the ability that he can bring to the table here at South Carolina.
So all positive so far. I mean, this is a guy who was a playmaker. I think if you look at the guys so far that are there, he's the one you're most likely to be saying, all right, we're going to move him around. We're going to get him on the field in the slot. We're going to get him on the field outside. I think as far as kind of playing that X receiver spot, it seems like he's the one who's playing there right now. We'll see if that's the way it ends up playing out as far as once you add potentially additional guys out of the transfer portal. Once you add the other part, Nick Harbor, add him back into the fold. What does that look like? How much do you think, and again, it's just a fact, it's a reality that Nick Harbor was going to do track.
Yeah.
That's part of the recruiting process. You accepted that when you offered him a scholarship, when you put all that effort into landing him. You accepted that he's a 2-sport athlete. So in no way am I saying, like, if you're South Carolina, you should be, like, worried about, well, man, how much better could he be getting if he was here in spring football practice? That energy gets you nowhere if you're the staff. But for us, how much do you think he is missing in not being able to actually get out there with a new quarterback as well?
Yeah, I mean, a lot, frankly. It is worth us talking about for the staff, like you said. Probably not worth wasting your time and energy on because it is what it is. But, when we're looking at it, you're kind of analyzing this room. There's no doubt. And it would be different if Nick Harbor had played high school wide receiver. He was a senior. He'd already been in this offense and gone through 2 or 3 seasons. That would be different. But he's still someone that, from a football standpoint, is very much still developing. So any on-field physical reps that he's missing are pretty significant. And I agree with your point about Gage. From what we have seen and heard, they are, Gage Larvadan, moving him around. Jared Brown, another guy that's got some versatility as far as he played slot for Coastal, but he can do some different things for you. And I think that's going to be a key is you want to be a program that when teams are game planning against you, they're not identifying the just one guy, and that's kind of where they were last year. 2022, yeah, you had Juice, but you had, Jalen Brooks, Josh Fent. You had other guys, and I think they were missing that last year. So from a holistic standpoint, if this can be a deeper room, even if there's not that one alpha, I think that's going to be a big thing for this team.
All right, you heard about offense. When we come back, you're going to hear about defense. Coach Torian Gray talking about that cornerback battle. Opposite OD Fortune is the game in the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour. All right, guys, closing this thing out. Gamecock Central Takeover Hour. Chris Clark, Wes Mitchell. Got some tickets to give away here in a second. I know Dave's excited about that. Just give it a second. We'll give it away here in a moment. And we were talking receivers on the other side. We're going to talk DBs before we close it out. Coach Torian Gray talking yesterday. And so, Chris, we actually have heard from Clayton White on the cornerback position opposite O.D. Fortune. We've heard from Shane Beamer on that same cornerback spot. And yesterday we heard from Torian Gray on that spot. So that's where we're going to go now. Cut 7, Dave.
Been a great spring thus far. I've been impressed with the competition. It's been a while since we've had this type of competition at a particular spot, meaning competition in depth at the same time. So I'm excited about Judge Collier and his progress. I'm excited about Vakari Swain, Emory Floyd. Those guys are growing up in front of our eyes and showing a different level of maturity. Now, are we there? Far from there, but, you know, we got talented guys, and then adding the addition of David Spalding, who played nickel and safety for us the last couple of years. We moved him to corner also, so now we got a veteran presence, a guy who's going to push those other guys and make them better, and it makes us better as a corner group. So OD's been solid and consistent. I know what we got with OD. We got a whole body of work to see from OD, but it's really exciting to know that one of those guys are going to step up, and a couple of those guys are going to step up, and we'll be pretty good.
And so Gray also later on went into more depth on Vakari and Collier. If we have time to hit that, we'll hit it here in a moment, Chris. But it is kind of interesting. We talked about it earlier this week, too. My perception of that position, I feel like, is shifting a little bit. Now, are they going to have 2 lockdown future NFL guys? I think that part is maybe to be determined. Does it seem like they're maybe actually going to potentially exit spring and feel like they have a little bit more depth there than maybe they did last year? I think that's very possible because, I mean, you didn't even know this time last year that Collier was going to be kind of the third guy, and he emerged as your top backup at both spots, and there really wasn't even, I would say, a 4th or 5th guy necessarily. Emory Floyd kind of emerged into that role. This year, I think you could have a full actual 2 deep at those 2 corner spots and maybe more.
Yeah, I think you could. And I think that's why, to go back to the conversation of in the portal, why did they not go get a corner even though they lost Marcellus Dial? Nowadays, if you lose a starter, you kind of go, okay, should we go get another starter in the portal? And sometimes there's a good argument to be made for that, but it seems like Torian Gray, Clayton White, Shane Beamer, the staff, the recruiting department felt like, look, we might have a question mark here opposite O.D. Fortune, but we've got some guys that we can plug in. I think there are some future NFL guys. When you look at Vakari Swain's athleticism, to me, it's going to be very surprising if in 2 or 3 years he doesn't have that opportunity.
They got to unlock that.
He's got to unlock it. He's not quite there yet. But Torian Gray, the good news is, has a really good track record of developing guys that have that skill set. You just look at Marcellus Dial, great example.
So other great news here. We do have some tickets to give away. South Carolina baseball, by the way, they're back in action today. Tough loss yesterday. We don't really have time in this show to get into it. I'm sure that Tyler and Terry probably will in the next 3 hours. But we got 2 pairs of tickets. This is South Carolina versus Texas A&M baseball, game 1, April 5th. So that's next Friday at Founders Park. We got 2 pairs. Call us now, 803-404-6100. Let's go caller 4 and 5. Dave, how's that sound? Just smile, Dave. It's okay. He's giving me the look. 4 and 5. Call right now. Gamecock baseball, Texas A&M, game 1 next week. That series again, April 5th, and man, they're lighting up. So, but Chris, final thoughts, man. Gamecock women winning tonight.
Yeah,
I think we're both. I think kind of comfortable.
Yeah, and you know what? After reading what Markeisha Grant wrote on Gamecock Central, shameless plug for her, great work. After reading Chris Wellbaum on Gamecock Central and talking to him earlier in segment 2, you know, I'm now like, all right, I think South Carolina's going to open this one up a little bit more. You know, I was originally kind of on the line, like this is going to be a tight game. I think it will be more of a challenge than North Carolina was. Certainly more of a challenge than PC was. Rounds 1 and 2, South Carolina blew the doors off of both of those. I'm not saying it's going to be that tonight, but I'm feeling a little bit more confident now that South Carolina is going to be able to win this one, I'd say more than comfortably.
Agree. And then hearing what he said about Notre Dame and Oregon State, too. I mean, we should, not to get ahead of ourselves, but hopefully on Monday we're sitting here, we're on this show from 11 to noon. We're talking about a South Carolina trip to the Final Four. All right, y'all, that's going to do it for us here. Hope everybody has a great weekend. The sun is shining in the capital city. Lots going on, lots of sports, lots of great stuff going on. We're going to turn it loose now. Tyler and Terry, they're live out at Sound and Images live show at Quaker Steak and Lube. That's Bluff Road at I-77. Go beat Terry at bowling right now. Go see him. They'll be live the next 3 hours. For Chris, I'm Wes. We'll see you next week.
All right, and if you're hungry, check out our friends at Firehouse Subs. There's a new limited time offering that's going to be completely live on Monday. It's the new barbecue Cuban Southern Roots with a Cuban twist. If you go to firehousesubs.com, you can get a little bit more info about it. Can't wait for that. But for now, until then, for the weekend, check out all of your Firehouse Subs favorites. And that can be an individual sandwich like the Italian, the hook and ladder, meatball sub, all the classic